We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph and Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 16a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the part of the Mishnah which said that when they brought the two todos as part of the ceremony to consecrate either the Azaros or the city of Yerushalayim, so it said that the Pnimis, the inner one, was eaten, and the Hachitzona, the outer one, it was Nisrefes, it was burned. And the question was, why exactly did they make that distinction? And now Rabbi Yochanan answers, Al Pi Novi Necheles ve'Al Pi Novi Nisrefes. Rather, it was through a Navi that it was determined that this one should be eaten, and it was through the Navi that it was determined that the other one should be burned. Rashi explains, Al Pi Navi means Chagai, Zechariah, Umalachi Hayusham. It means Chagai and Zechariah and Malachi, they were there. This is again by the time of the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, and they were sanctifying Yerushalayim. V'Al Pi and Beruach HaKodesh also, when this was just done through them, Beruach HaKodesh, that the inner one should be eaten and the outer one should be burned. Ve'ein tam b'davar. No, there's no real reason behind it. It was just the instruction of the Navi. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Kol shelo nasis b'chol elu v'chulu. It said any time that they try to be Mekadesh, the Azaros, or Yerushalayim, and they don't do all of these ceremonial procedures that are mentioned in the Mishnah, so then it's not going to have that holiness. And the Gemara says, Itmar, it was stated the following, Machlokas Amoraim. Rav Huna Amar, Rav Huna says, B'chol elu tnan. It means all of these parts of the ceremony have to be done in order for the addition to have that Kedusha. That's what's learned in the Mishnah. Rav Nachman Amar, Rav Nachman says, Biachas mikol elu tnan. It just means one of these things. You don't have to do all of these various things in the ceremony. Even one is enough to create the Kedusha. And the Gemara continues and explains, Rav Huna Amar, Rav Huna says, B'chol elu tanan, you have to do all of these ceremonial procedures, because Rav Huna holds, Kedusha Rishon and Kitcha L'Shaita v'Kitcha L'Asad Lovo, the original Kedusha from the first Beis HaMikdash of that Kedusha was Kadosh at that time, and it's Kadosh in the future. That Kedusha never really left, and therefore there actually was no need to sanctify anything in the times of Ezra by the returning to the second Beis HaMikdash. The Ezra Zecher B'Almahu David, Ezra just did something as a remembrance for what they used to do, and so therefore Rav Huna says it's B'chol elu, really everything has to be used, and in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, as we'll see in Rashi in a moment, they did not have the ability to do all of these things, but it didn't really matter. It was just a Zecher B'Alma, because the original Kedusha was still there. Rav Nachman says, Biachas mikol elu tanan. You only need to have one of these ceremonial procedures, because Rav Nachman holds, Kedusha Rishon and Kitcha L'Shaita v'lo Kitcha L'Asad Lavo. The original Kedusha was Kadosh at that time, but it was not Kadosh for the future. They had to re-sanctify in the times of Ezra. The Ezra Kedusha Kadosh, and therefore Ezra was creating this Kedusha. He was sanctifying the area, the city of Yerushalayim. Afal gav delo have Urim v'Tumim, even though there was no Urim v'Tumim at that time. That's the point that it wasn't possible to do B'chol elu at that time, and so therefore Rav Nachman says it must be Biachas mikol elu. Even one of these items as part of the ceremonial procedure is going to be enough. And Rashi explains, Rav Huna Amar B'chol elu tanan kasavar. Rav Huna holds all of these ceremonial procedures had to be done. Kilomer, what it means to say is as follows: V'i mishum kiddush Ezra. If you're going to ask a question from the sanctification, from the consecration that Ezra did, the Havoy B'bayis Sheni, that was done again in the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, below Melech there was no king, below Urim v'Tumim there was no Urim v'Tumim. Da'amrina b'Meseches Yuma, we say Meseches Yuma, Chamisha Dvarim Chaser Mikdasheni, that there were 5 things that were missing from the second Beis HaMikdash: Eish, U'Shechina, v'Aron, v'Urim v'Tumim, v'Ruach HaKodesh. Those are the 5 things that were missing. So the answer is, Kasavar Rav Huna holds, Kedusha Rishona de David u'Shlomo, that original Kedusha at the times of David and Shlomo, Lo B'Teila, was never nullified. V'Lo Hutzrach Ezra L'Kadesh, and Ezra did not need to sanctify anything. Kilomar, meaning to say, Shulo Hosef Klum Ba'orech V'Rochev, that he didn't add anything on in terms of the length and the width. Umay de Kadesh K'dichsev Ha'amida Shtei Todos, and that which it seems in Nehemiah that he was sanctifying something, like it says that he brought those 2 Todos, L'Zecher B'Alma, but that was just a remembrance, but it was not really a sanctification. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei Rava Rav Nachman, Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question. Again, Rav Nachman says, it's Biachas mikol elu, but the problem is the Mishnah said, Kol shelo nasis b'chol elu. It says exactly what Rav Huna said. It says that it has to be all of these ceremonial procedures. And Rav Nachman responds, Tani, rather what it really should say, you should amend the Mishnah to say as follows, Biachas mikol elu. What it actually should say is Biachas mikol elu. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come and hear a proof from the following Braisa. Abashol, Omer Abashol says, Shnei bitzin hayu bahar hamishcha. there were two ponds in Har HaMishcha, Tachtona ve'Elyona, there was a lower one and an upper one. Tachtona niskadsha b'chol elu, the lower one, it was sanctified with all of these ceremonial procedures, but Elyona, but the upper one, lo niskadsha b'chol elu, it was not sanctified with all of these ceremonial procedures. Ella ba'ole gola, rather it was sanctified with those who came up from the exile. Shalo b'melech, there was no king, v'shalo b'urim v'tumim, and there was no urim v'tumim. And so therefore the Brisa continues, Tachtona, when it comes to the lower pond, Shahaisa Kedushasa Gemura, which had a full Kedusha, that was the one that had the full Kedusha, was Neskadsha B'chol Elu. So Amei Ha'aretz Nechnasin L'sham Va'ochlin Sham Kodshim Kalim, so the Amei Ha'aretz, they would enter that area and they would eat over there the Kodshim Kalim, Avalo Meiser Sheni, but they would not eat the Meiser Sheni over there. The Chaverim, and the Chaverim who were learned, Ochlin Sham Kodshim Kalim, Meiser Sheni, they ate the Kodshim Kalim and the Meiser Sheni there, because again it had the full Kedusha of Yerushalayim, so they ate Kodshim Kalim and Meiser Sheni there, which had to be eaten in Yerushalayim. Elyona, when it came to the upper pond, Shalo Haisa Kedusha Gemura, which did not have the full Kedusha, Amei Ha'aretz Hayu Nechnasin Sham, the Amei Ha'aretz would enter there, V'yochlin Sham Kodshim Kalim, and they would eat over there the Kodshim Kalim, Avalo Meiser Sheni, but they would not eat the Meiser Sheni. V'chaverim, and those who were more learned, Ein Ochlin Sham, they would not eat there, Lo Kodshim Kalim, V'lo Meiser Sheni, they wouldn't eat there because it was not really part of Yerushalayim, so they wouldn't eat the Kodshim Kalim or the Meiser Sheni there. Umivnei Malo Ketchu, and why was it that it was not sanctified? She'ein Mosifin Alo Ir V'Alho Azaros, because you cannot add on to the city or the Azaros, Ela B'melech V'Navi V'Urim V'Tumim U'V'Sanhedrin Shel Ayin Aleph U'V'Shtei Todos U'V'Shir. You have to have all of these parts of the ceremonial procedure, the king and the Navi, the Urim V'Tumim, the Sanhedrin of 71, the two Todos, and with song. And the Brisa continues, V'loma Kitshua. Now, why did they sanctify it? And the Gemara interrupts and asks, Loma Kitshua, what do you mean, why did they sanctify it? Ha'amrit lo Kitshua, you just said that they did not sanctify it. Ella, rather, what the Brisa is asking is, Loma Hichnisua, why did they build a wall over there and enter it in physically within Yerushalayim? The reason for that is, Mimnei Shetorfa Shal Yerushalayim Haisa, because it was a weak point of Yerushalayim. V'nocha Hili Kavish Misham, it would have been easy to conquer Yerushalayim from there, so they needed to enclose it, they needed to protect that area. And Rashi explains, Bahar HaMishcha, Har HaZesim, that refers to Har HaZesim. Tachtona ve'Elyona, again there was a lower pond and an upper pond. B'Shipua Hahar Hayu, these were on the slope of the mountain. V'Achas Lamala Begavo V'Achas B'Shipulo, one was a little higher, one was a little lower. Tachtona Niskadsha B'chol Elu. So the Brisa said that the lower one was fully sanctified. What that means is Shemiyamei Bayis Rishon Hichnisua V'Chibru Ala'ir. It was during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash that they included into the city Al Yedei Choma Acheres, with another wall, and so therefore during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash it was possible to use all of the ceremonial procedures, so it had that kedusha. Ela ba'olei gola, but when it came to the upper one, that was only done with the olei gola, those who came up from the exile. Shehosifu alo iru vanu hekef choma acheres lachutz. They came to the city, they added on to the city, and they built that extra wall. Hachi Garcina Labitosef, the Sanhedrin, here's the proper text. Tachtona Shaisa Kedusha Gemura, again by the lower one, which had the full Kedusha. Amei Haaretz Nechnasim L'Sham V'Ochlam Sham Kodshim Kalim Avalo Meiser Sheni. The Amei Haaretz, they would eat Kodshim Kalim there, but not Meiser Sheni. The Chaverim Ochlam Sham Meiser Sheni V'Kodshim Kalim. The Chaverim would eat there, both the Meiser Sheni and the Kodshim Kalim, and had the full Kedusha. Elyona Shaloisa Kedusha Gemura, the upper one, which did not have the full Kedusha. Amei Haaretz Nechnasim Sham V'Ochlam Sham Kodshim Kalim Avalo Meiser Sheni. The Amei Haaretz would go there, they would eat Kodshim Kalim and not Meiser Sheni. The Chaverim, but the Chaverim, Ein Ochlam Sham, Lo Kodshim Kalim, V'lo Meiser Sheni, they understood that it was not part of Yerushalayim, so they did not eat Kodshim Kalim or Meiser Sheni there. And Rashi explains, V'yesh Lefarish, one can explain this as follows. When it came to Meiser, the Amei Haaretz were a little more careful. Because they knew about the drasha that if you take off Meiser, if you do that properly, so then you'll become wealthy. Plus, there's a vidoy, there's a confession that you do that you did properly the Meiseris. They heard the translation of that pasuk that you're going to eat lifnei Hashem. That's why they made sure to enter within that inner wall of Yerushalayim to fulfill the pasuk of lifnei Hashem Elokecha. They were very careful when it came to Ma'aser Sheni. But when it came to Kachim, they wouldn't bother themselves so much. They would even eat it as long as they were within the outer wall. Let's say if they didn't find someone a place to stay in the inside. When people would say to them, you can't eat it over here because this area is holy, but that area where you are is not holy, they wouldn't listen to us. They would say, what do you mean? There's a wall here and there's a wall there. Mali tachtona, mali eliona. What does it matter if it's the lower pond or the upper pond? And why did it enclose? Why did they bother enclosing it if it wasn't really part of Yerushalayim? Shator fashal Yerushalayim gluya ve'ervasim makom shinoch likavesh. It was like a weak point of Yerushalayim, an easy place where if you would enter there, you'd be able to conquer it. So that's why they enclosed it within the walls, even though it did not have that kedusha. And in any case, we see from the above brisa, like Rav Huna, that b'chol elu, you need to have all of the ceremonial procedures in order to have the kedusha. And so the Gemara continues and answers Tanoihi. This is actually a machlokas Tanoim. To Tanya, because we learned in a brisa. So Amar Rabbi Eliezer said, Shamati, I heard, Kishayu bonin behechol, when they would build in the hechol, asu kloim lahechol, they had curtains, they made curtains for the hechol. Ukloim lazaros, they also had curtains for the azaros. Elisha behechol bonin mibachutz, but when it came to the hechol, they would build on the outside. Uvazaros bonin mibifnim, when it came to the azaros, they would build on the inside. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua says, Shamati, I heard, Shamakriven afal pishein bayis, that one can bring karbanos even without a Beis HaMikdash, Ochlan kachei kachim, afal pishein kloim, one can eat kachei kachim even if there's no curtains, kachim kalam and meiser sheni, and one can eat kachim kalam and meiser sheni, afal pishein choma, even though there's no wall, memnesha kedusha rishon and kitchel ashaita, v'kitchel asid lava, because the original kedusha was kadosh at that time, and it's kadosh in the future. So clearly Rabbi Yoshua is saying, kitchel ashaita, v'kitchel asid lava, and the Gemara says, Lav Mechlal, doesn't that imply to Rabbi Eliezer, Savar Lo Kitchel Asid Lavo, that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that it's Lo Kitchel Asid Lavo, and so therefore you see a Machlokas Tanoim in terms of Kitchel Ashait and Kitchel Asid Lavo, and as we said above, the Machlokas Amoraim above, Bechol Elu or Achas Mikol Elu is really the same Machlokas, whether Kedusha Rishon and Kitchel Ashaita, the Kitchel Asid Lavo, and so therefore the Gemara is suggesting again that this is a Machlokas Tanoim. Rashi explains, Tanoi, it's a Machlokas Tanoim, Tepligi Bekedusha Rishon Ashaita, Vila Asid Lava. They're arguing whether the Kedusha Rishona is in the future or not. Leman Amar Lo Kitcha Asid Lava. According to the one who says that it's Lo Kitcha Asid Lava, which right now the Gemara assumes is Rabbi Eliezer, Itzrich Ezra Lekadsha, so then Ezra is going to actually need to come in and be Mekadesh at the times of the Bayis Sheni. V'kitcha below Melech v'Urim v'Tumim, and then clearly he sanctified it, even though there was no king and there was no Urim v'Tumim. V'Islei Achas Mikol Elu, and so therefore that opinion, the one that holds Lo Kitcha Asid Lava, is holding Achas Mikol Elu Tanan. That's what it said in the Mishnah. Well, Aman Damar Kitcha Asid Lava, the one who says that it's Kitcha Asid Lava, which seems to be the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, Lo Hutzrach Ezra Lekadesh Klum. Ezra did not need to sanctify anything. Elo Lezecher Bialma. He just needed to do it as a remembrance of what they used to do. V'lo Gamrin and Mino, we would not learn from what Ezra did. And Rashi continues again. Rabbi Eliezer said, Shamati, I heard Mei Rabosai from my Rebbeim, Kishayu Bonin Ahechel Bimei Ezra. What he's referring to is when they would build the Hechel in the times of Ezra, Osim Koloim B'Mokom HaChoma, they made these curtains in the area where the wall was, Ubonim Eskos LeHachoma Eitzel HaKloim, and then they would build the actual walls by those curtains, V'chein LaAzaros, and they did this also by the Azaros, but the difference only was as follows. Elisha Behechel, in the Hechel of the Beis HaMikdash, Nasnu HaKloim Lifnim Mimakom HaChoma, the curtains were actually within the area of the walls, Ubonim Es HaChoma Mibachutz, and they built the wall on the outside, Shelo Yizonu Einei Min HaHechel, that way people will not be able to see the Heichel. Right now we think that these kloim, according to Rabbi Eliezer, these curtains, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it was in order to make the Azara a kosher place to bring a carbon. Because if there is no Beis HaMikdash, there's no carbon. Because again, right now we're assuming Rabbi Eliezer holds Kedusha Rishona is not Kitchel Liasid Lavo, and so therefore this was part of that sanctification. And then Rabbi Yoshua responds, it's not true, you don't need to have. You can bring, even though there is no Beis HaMikdash, and even though there's no wall, Yerushalayim, meaning if there's no wall in Yerushalayim, Kodem Shenivnes HaChoma, even before the wall is built. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi, Ravina said to Rav Ashi, Mimai, how do you know that there's really a machlokas tanoim over here, whether kitcha l'asad lava or not? It's clear that Rabbi Yoshua is saying kitcha l'shaita, v'kitcha l'asad lava, but it's not necessarily true that Rabbi Eliezer argues, because Dilma may be dekuli alma, kedusha rishona kitcha l'shaita, v'kitcha l'asad lava. Maybe everybody agrees that it's kitcha l'asad lava, that kedusha was there, it continues into the future as well. Umar mai deshmiya leikamer, and just Rabbi Eliezer was saying what he heard. Umar and the other master was also saying what he heard. If you're going to say Koloim lo Rabbi Eliezer lamali, then what's the purpose of these curtains? So the answer to that is Litzniusa bialma. That was just for a certain amount of privacy, a certain amount of modesty. And Rashi explains Umay deshmiya velo bar Rabbi Yoshua lachlok. It could be Rabbi Yoshua is not even arguing al Rabbi Eliezer. He's not arguing on Rabbi Eliezer. Velo shamei Rabbi Eliezer do amar lo kitcha. He never heard Rabbi Eliezer say it was not sanctified. Maybe they all agree in terms of kitcha liyasid lavo. And again, the idea simply is that Rabbi Eliezer holds this is what they did, and they did it for reasons of privacy, for reasons of tznius, but it had nothing to do with making that kedusha, with renewing that kedusha in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. And so the Gemara continues, Ela rather hani tanoi, the machlokas tanoim of whether kitcha l'asad lava or not is in the following. The Tanya, because we learned in a brayso, Amar Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi says, Lama manu chacham meselu. Why in the Mishnah do the chachamim enumerate these specific cities as walled cities? There are various halachos that concern walled cities, when really we know there are many more walled cities. And so Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi says, Shekesha'alu b'nei hagola, because when those who came from the exile, when they came up, Motzu elu v'kitchum, they found these cities and they sanctified them. Aval Rishonos, but the earlier ones, Batlu Mishabat La'aretz, they already, the Kedusha was nullified from the time that the land was nullified, meaning from the time of the exile. So Alma, so what do we see? Kasavar, Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel Ashaita, Velo Kitchel Asad Lava, from what Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi seems to be saying, is that the original Kedusha was not Kitchel Asad Lava, and that's why they had to sanctify it once again. But the Gemara continues, or a mini, but we have a contradiction to that. Because Amar Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi says, this is going to be a seeming contradiction within Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. In this brayso it says, Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi says, V'chi elu bilvad hayu, were these the only cities, the only walled cities, v'halo kvar nemar, but doesn't already say, Shishim ir kol chevel argov mamleches og babashan, kol eila orim betzuros choma gavoa. It says all of these cities, these 60 cities, they were all fortified cities with walls. So you see there were many more cities that had walls from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Elalama manu chacham meselu. So rather, why is it the chacham enumerated just these cities? Shekesha'alu b'nei hagola, because when those from the exile came up, motzu elu v'kitchum, they found these cities and they sanctified them. The Gemara says, Kitchum Hashta, the Gemara says, they sanctified them right now. Don't we say later on, that according to this brayso, that it was not necessary to sanctify them. Rather, this brayso is saying, this version of Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi is saying, they found these particular cities and they enumerated them. But it's really not just these cities. Anything where we have a tradition from your fathers, that it was surrounded by a wall from the days of Yoshua ben Nun, Kol mitzvahs elu nohagos ba, all of these mitzvahs that apply to walled cities will apply to such cities, mipnei, because shekadusha rishona kitchel hashaita v'kitchel asid lavo, because the original kedusha was kadosh then, and it's kadosh in the future, and so clearly in this brayso, in this version of Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, it seems to be that kitchel asid lavo, and so you see a machlokas tanoim between these two braysos. The Gemara asks the obvious question, kasha Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, ad Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, well, these two braysos, it's a contradiction within Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, they're both bringing the sheet of Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, but they're saying the opposite. One says lo kitchel liyasid lavo, and the other one says kitchel liyasid lavo. And the Gemara says, if you want, I can say trei tanoi al libed Rabbi Yishmael Bar Yossi. It's a machlokas tanoim, what Rabbi Yishmael Bar Yossi said, and so again you see there is a machlokas tanoim in this regard. Or if you want, we can say chadaminayu Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi. One of the braysos is actually not Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, maybe it's actually Rabbi Lazar Bar Yossi. Titania, because we learned in another brayso, Rabbi Lazar Bar Yossi Omer, Rabbi Lazar Bar Yossi says, Asher lo choma, it says Asher lo choma, and we darshan that to mean, Afal pi she'ein lo achshav, even though right now it does not have, v'haya lo kodem lachein, but it had one before, and so you see in this brayso it's saying, even though it had it earlier, apparently kitchel yasid lavo, that's Rabbi Lazar Bar Rabbi Yossi. And Rashi explains, Lama manu ayaros manu chachamim beparak basra de Erchin. There were various cities that the chachamim enumerated in the last parak of Erchin, shahayu mukafos choma miyamos Yoshua ben Nun, that they were surrounded by a wall from the days of Yoshua ben Nun. Le'inyan mitzvahs batei orechoma. This is relevant to the mitzvah of batei orechoma, that's houses in a walled city. V'hayolhem limnos od harbe shalomonim. Now they should have counted many more cities that were not enumerated. V'kitchum, and again they sanctified these particular cities. Rashi notes, lo porish li bamem mekudoshim arei Eretz Yisrael. I don't know exactly how you sanctify cities of Eretz Yisrael. Kasavar lo kitcha, again it sounds like this brisa holds lo kitcha lasid lavo, uramini, and then we have a contradiction of brisa that sounds like kitchum lasid lavo, hainu tanoi, that's the machlokas tanoim, you have two brisas saying different things. V'chi elu bilvad hayu mukafos choma mimos Yoshua ben Nun. Again, are these the only city that are mukafos choma, that are surrounded by a wall from the days of Yoshua ben Nun? Motzu elu derech biyasim. It happens to be they found these as they were entering the land. Meaning as this brisa concludes, it's going to end and say that the other cities as well have that kedusha, and so therefore there was no need, according to the second brisa, no need to re-sanctify anything, because again that second brisa holds kitchum lasid lavo. And finally Rashi says, Kol ha-mitzvos ha'elu, all of these mitzvahs, meaning mitzvahs batei orechoma, meaning the mitzvah of the houses of the orechoma, v'shiluach mitzoraim, and also sending out mitzoraim, v'shein osam migrashay sad. Another halacha that's relevant is you can't have the open areas, you can't make them into fields. In any case, again, the point is, any city where there's a misora, according to the second brisa, that it was mukafos choma miyamos Yoshua ben Nun, so all of these various mitzvahs that apply to mukafos choma are going to apply. And again, we see that from the second brisa, kitchel lasid lavo, so you see that it in fact is a machlokas tanoim, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tazayin Amid Beis.